25 years ago today, tanks and troops of the People's Liberation Army turned their guns on the people in downtown Beijing, ending nearly 2 months of student democracy protests. Back then, the street behind me resembled a war zone as the army converged on Tiananmen Square with orders to crush the protest using live ammunition. Hundreds and perhaps thousands of students, workers, and ordinary citizens were killed, most of them not in Tiananmen Square itself, but in the roads leading into the center of the city. Today, downtown Beijing once again resembles a war zone, with heavily armed paramilitary, police, and undercover agents flooding the streets. In the 10 years I've been covering this anniversary, I've never seen quite this level of security and paranoia from the authorities. Foreign journalists and their Chinese staff have been threatened, detained, harassed, and intimidated for trying to cover an event that the Chinese government has all but erased from history. Despite the show of force, China's leaders appear petrified that any attempts to remember those tragic events could transform into some calls for greater political freedoms today. 25 years on from the idealism and the hope of 1989, China is becoming more authoritarian and less democratic, even as it continues to implement economic reforms. Jamil Andolini, Financial Times, Beijing.
I don't know how many of them will still survive. But I knew many of them died. Before the coming of the soldier, they were so peaceful, very peaceful, singing song, because there were so many times that they heard about the soldier were coming. And I have to say that many of them have the preparation that they would die. And the reason why they were so peaceful was, at that time, many of them were writing their will, the letter to their parents. They have the preparation that they are not coming back. The most shocking experience was the first moment I encountered with the killing. And I, by myself, to save that person. Because at that moment, I really realized that I really know that soldiers were relentlessly shot at the citizens and the students. So that moment was very shocking to me, because when I walked through the western part, the street, I was so startled that the whole street was blood. And at that time, tanks were still occupying those crossroads. There were soldiers, and all the fences were broken, torn down. And one thing I didn't understand at that time was even the civilians' apartment, all the windows were broken. And then one of the civilians told me, when the soldier coming from the west, it was so crazy. Even the civilian, the citizen, the student were running away. They still shoot from the back. And therefore, the citizens at their household were so angry, and they threw everything they could against the soldier. And therefore, the soldier simply fired back. Even after so many years, firstly, I have to say I do miss them. And for the family, I think it's such a trauma that they cannot bear.
October the 1st, 1949, and Chairman Mao has proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Almost 67 years on, he still dominates Tiananmen Square in the heart of Beijing. His portrait over the gates of heavenly peace, and his corpse in the mausoleum on the other side of the square, where people come 6 days a week to pay their respects. But his legacy still divides opinion. Was he a tyrant or an idol?
All my generation thinks he's a good man. The younger generation don't know him.
Mao had good traits and bad, but there were more good than bad. His biggest mistake was the Cultural Revolution.
That revolution began in 1967, when millions of his young foot soldiers, known as Red Guards, responded to his call to rid the Communist Party of dissent. But he lost control of the uprising he began. The purge of the party and mass killings would last until his death almost a decade later. There has never been a full accounting for the chaos of the Cultural Revolution or for Mao's most disastrous policy of all, the Great Leap Forward, his attempt to modernize China's economy that led to famine and, say some historians, the deaths of at least 45 million people. Zhang Lifan spent almost 9 years in a labor camp from 1969, accused of counter-revolutionary crimes. Now Zhang is an historian who insists his views on Mao are impartial.
Communists love Mao because Mao was the only source for their legitimacy. Even in internal party documents, Mao has been rated 30% bad and 70% good. Mao was never totally disapproved.
China's current leader, Xi Jinping, also wants to unite the masses. He wore a Mao-style suit when he presided over a recent military parade in Beijing, and often speaks out against what he calls hostile foreign forces, just as Mao once did.
Now what we are seeing is a farce. Everyone is looking at his imitation of Mao as a joke. There's no way you can build another Mao. Because of the internet, people are not brainwashed anymore.
Mao's image remains the Communist Party's most powerful symbol, and he's still a crowd puller. Each year, millions of Chinese come to pay homage in the village where he was born, and the crowd is expected to be very big today. Adrian Brown, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
All ideas contrary to Mao's thinking and the objects that represented them had to be destroyed. Not just Confucianism and Buddhism, but even more so foreign faiths like Christianity. Throughout the country, churches were closed, clergy unfrocked, religious symbols smashed. The statue of the Virgin Mary was replaced by a portrait of Mao. One form of worship gave way to another.
It has to become a better world, and of course it didn't. It became a much worse world.
The physical destruction wrought by the Red Guards was unparalleled even in China's long history. Monasteries all over the country, as far away as distant Tibet, were ransacked and razed to the ground. The most important sites, like the Forbidden City, were protected on the orders of Zhou Enlai. But elsewhere, Mao's stormtroops had free rein. Zhou Enlai's implicit distinction between smashing bourgeois ideas and smashing bourgeois individuals was quickly forgotten. Over the next few weeks, tens of thousands of people in Beijing were harangued and severely beaten. Many hundreds died.
I can remember as though it were yesterday watching a group of strongly built students, including some of my own classmates, boys who practiced martial arts, jump up onto the platform.
1928, until he dared to criticize the chairman's Great Leap Forward, was dragged out and publicly vilified. To his Red Guard accusers, Peng was a three antes element: wasteful, corrupt and bureaucratic, disloyal to Chairman Mao. Jiang Wen-tian, Mao's predecessor as party leader in the 1930s, was damned alongside him. Both men had devoted their lives to the Chinese Revolution. Now, they have no rights. He was undergoing a slow descent into hell. The highest-ranking victims were brought out for public humiliation before mass meetings in a football stadium. They wore placards around their necks with their names crossed out like common criminals awaiting execution. Wu Han was a playwright, one of whose works angered Mao. The chairman used it as a pretext to overthrow Wu's patron, the mayor of Beijing, Peng Zhen. purge he'd set in motion would eventually claim other victims, still higher in the chain of command. Meanwhile, Peng and his colleagues were left to twist in the wind.
"万岁！伟大的中国人民万岁！伟大的中的是四面巨幅标语，伟大
29架直10和直19汇成100字样，共产党走过100年光辉历程。100年，是筚路蓝缕奠基。